So today I want to read to all of you some developments when it comes to antidepressants, because there's been all this talk over the past couple years, a huge debate between those who say get rid of them, stop prescribing them, these things are dangerous, and those, obviously in the psychiatry field, that want to continuously defend these antidepressants, these SSRI. Doesn't even have to be SSRI, but those are the ones being looked at the most. But really anything that does what these antidepressants do. They don't have to be SSRIs, by the way. If it disrupts serotonin production and increases dopamine like this, then you need to listen, and listen very carefully. Philip Hickey, PhD, April 8th, 2014. In June 2011, a guy whose name I can't pronounce, medical doctor, published an article titled Tardive Dysphoria, the role of long-term antidepressant use in inducing chronic depression, a medical hypothesis, the journal. The article is a thorough and wide-ranging study review. Here are some quotes from the abstract. Treatment-resistant and chronic depression appear to be increasing. Depressed patients who ultimately become treatment-resistant frequently have a positive initial response to antidepressants and invariably have received these agents for prolonged time periods at high doses. Emphasis added. The authors proposed the term tardive dysphoria to describe this condition. Tardive means delayed, dysphoria means unhappy or depressed. The idea is that just as prolonged ingestion of neuroleptics causes tardive dyskinesia, muscle spasms, so the prolonged ingestion of antidepressants causes tardive dysphoria, permanent depression. It's a nice idea, but the name hasn't caught on, at least not yet. Oh, I'm going to change that. The paper is very detailed and cites 85 references. The arguments are well marshaled and compelling. Here's a brief summary. Depression affects about 5% of the world's population. Risk of recurrence is high, about 50 to 80%. Maintenance antidepressant therapy may reduce the risk of relapse in the first year after an episode. The APA recommends maintenance therapy for recurrent major depression, but recurrence of depression is common even among individuals on maintenance therapy. Recurrences of this sort are called treatment-resistant depression, or TRD for short, the prevalence of which among depressed individuals may be as high as 30 to 50%. This prevalence has increased from about 10 to 15% in the early 1990s to about 40% in 2006. Various reasons have been suggested for this increase, but there are reasons to believe, this is in the quote, that antidepressant treatment itself may contribute to a chronic depressive syndrome. The authors provide a great deal of evidence in support of this conclusion. Quote, up to 80% of patients diagnosed with major depressive disorder will experience a recurrence of depressive episodes despite constant maintenance dose of an antidepressant. Attempts to treat these individuals frequently result in poor response and the rise of TRD. There have been several reports of the loss of antidepressant efficacy. End quote. And then he goes on to say, and perhaps the most telling, quote, a long-term placebo-controlled blind maintenance study of fluoxetine, i.e. Prozac, in major depression found no difference after 62 weeks in subjects who were still euthymic on Florentine or placebo. The Florentine, i.e. Prozac, was 11%, placebo was 16%. Placebo actually worked better. The same doctor he has been quoting points out that individuals who were not initially depressed but were given antidepressants for other problems like anxiety often became significantly depressed. Quote, in a recent study, 27% of patients without any history of a mood disorder who had received antidepressants for an average of 29 months for panic disorders developed a cyclical themic illness that persisted for 1 year after antidepressant continuation. End quote. He begins again. Also, and perhaps most alarmingly, it is stated, quote, in patients who have developed TDP, tardive dysphoria, ongoing attempts to treat the depression with antidepressants perpetuate the tardive dysphoria and may ultimately make the chronic depression permanent. Now I'm going to stop there because this is a long article. You can read it for yourself. I'll have the links to all of these. But here's another one saying the same thing. 3 recently published papers, along with a report by a Minnesota group on health outcomes. By the way, this is psychologytoday.com. The Minnesota group on health outcomes in that state, provide new reasons to mull over this question. Do antidepressants worsen long-term course of depression? As I wrote in An Anatomy of an Epidemic, I believe there is convincing evidence that the drugs do just that. These latest papers add to that evidence base. Although this concern first surfaced in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when a handful of psychiatrists expressed concern that antidepressants were causing a chronification of the disorder, it was in 1994 that an Italian psychiatrist, Guy Fava, these damn names, editor of Psychotherapy and Psychosemantics, urged the field to directly confront this possibility. He wrote, within the field of psychopharmacology, practitioners have been cautious, if not fearful, of opening a debate on whether the treatment is more damaging than helpful. I wonder if the time has come for debating and initiating research into the likelihood that psychotropic drugs actually worsen, at least in some cases, the progression of the illness which they are supposed to treat. End quote. He goes on to say, in subsequent papers, Fava set forth a biological explanation for why this may be so. Psychiatric drugs perturb neurotransmitter pathways in the brain, and in response to that perturbation, the brain undergoes a series of compensatory adaptations in an effort to maintain normal functioning of those systems. In scientific terms, the brain is trying to restore its homeostatic equilibrium. Fava has dubbed this compensatory response to a psychiatric drug oppositional tolerance. For instance, SSRI drugs block the normal reuptake of serotonin from the synaptic cleft, which is the tiny gap between neurons. Serotonin now stays in the cleft longer than normal, and feedback mechanisms immediately kick into gear. The presynaptic neurons begin putting out less serotonin than usual, while the postsynaptic neurons, the neurons receiving the message, decrease the density of their receptors for serotonin. Ooh, that doesn't sound good. The drug is acting as an accelerator of steroidogenic activity. The brain responds by putting down the brake. When Fava first raised this issue in the 1990s, several American researchers wrote that this was a valid concern which needed to be investigated. One who did so was same guy that I mentioned in the article previously, who is apparently at the University of Louisville School of Medicine. He has periodically revisited this issue, and in a paper published in the June issue of Medical Hypotheses, he provides an overview of emerging evidence that in some individuals, persistent use of antidepressants may be pro-depressant. And it goes through the same thing that I already told you. And then there's one on the Huffington Post. Yeah, so there's 3 articles. I'm going to give you links to all this information because this is a huge problem. Because if you're taking antidepressants and antipsychotics for as long as most in my generation have, as in since like 8 or 9 years old until they're, dead? Some stop by the time they're 30, I guess. I've heard of that. Some stop by the time they're 20 or their mid-20s, but still, that's over a decade at least for the vast majority of men in my age group. Does this have something to do with the problem men are facing? I used to be on these drugs. I'm off them now, and I can tell you right now, I don't see much of a difference. I think I have this. Tardive dysphoria. I really do. Thanks a lot, psychiatry. You're so awesome. And so, think about that. It reduces the serotonin being produced by the brain naturally. It then proceeds to make it more difficult for synapses to absorb serotonin at the same time. Oh, and something else that these articles pointed out was that the branches on the, dendrite, they begin to grow a lot more than they're supposed to. Now, how exactly that produces depression, I'm not sure. Maybe it's because there's not enough neurotransmitters. I have seen studies, I have read studies that claim that antidepressants increase your neuroplasticity. So even though it's destroying the neurological chemicals needed for you to have those normal brain functions, because you have to have serotonin, you have to have dopamine, you have to have these neurotransmitters, or else it doesn't matter how many connections your brain has. You'll never be able to get it. Because there just won't be enough transmitters. And yet, it makes neuroplasticity higher. It makes the branches on the dendrite expand even more. Another thing I also saw was that in these articles that the basal ganglia has been damaged. They claim that these damage the basal ganglia. For example, excessive moistening of your tongue, of your lips with your tongue, constantly licking your lips. They say that that's a sign, possible sign. And if you look up the basal ganglia, look at what, here's what it says on Wikipedia, what it's for. The basal ganglia are associated with a variety of functions including control of voluntary motor movements, procedural learning, that's something I have trouble with, routine behaviors or habits such as bruxism, eye movements, cognition, and emotion. Wow, these medicines possibly damage that? And this has been known since the fucking 60s and 70s? That's criminal. That's criminal that you psychiatrists get away with not telling anybody about this and just making tons of money off of these drugs. You should be thrown in jail and ass raped. So yeah, look at that. Look at that. There's your analysis for today. Never go on antidepressants. Bye, folks.